Well, I just want to thank you all for coming to the Irish Club of Alaska's February virtual program. Um, it's so exciting to be able to bring people from all over the world together in this way during the pandemic. And if you would, in the chat, put where you're from and how you found out about this. That would help me. If I am able to save the chat, I will be able to collate some information as to whether you heard about it from Miguel or from the Irish Club or from me personally, or one of the other members. And Miguel is somebody that I have met through the Abolish Geography song circle that some of you may know about. I've been an avid goer of virtual Zoom song circles all over the world, and this has been one of my favorite fortnightly circles to attend. I've learned a lot of new tunes coming out of Australia. And Miguel always has something interesting, whether it's a show tune or an ecologically supportive song or a labor song. It seems like between being a choir director of Ecopella or his Irish experience with Triniton, or I don't know, all the things that you've done, Miguel, but it seems like you just have a wealth of varieties of songs and information, and you're obviously a historian too, and a performer. So we're really excited to hear your program tonight, Frank the Poet, and thank you and welcome. I will turn it over to you and unspotlight myself. Everyone clap virtually, yay!
Thank you so much, Dawn. I'm bringing this show to you from Gadigal country. The people of the Eora Nation never ceded this land. Although this is a story from colonial history, Aborigines don't appear in it very much, which is unfortunate, but that's our topic today is Francis McNamara, an Irish convict. There is a book called Frank the Poet, published in 1979, much of it now out of date, but it was a pioneer work by John Meredith and Rex Whalen, both deceased now. And but I nevertheless want to acknowledge they made a seminal contribution to scholarship on this subject. And Mark Gregory, a union activist who has a magnificent website where he's collected all of the resources that relate to Frank McNamara. My name is Francis McNamara, a native of Cashel in the county Tipperary. Sworn tyranny's foe, and while I've life, I'll crow. That was a lie. He probably wasn't from Tipperary, but just chose it to make a bad rhyme with his surname. Frank would lie to the prison authorities about his profession and about his religion and about his origins, just to keep them on the back foot as much as possible. We'll see a bit later on that he very likely came from County Cork. We don't know anything about his early upbringing. We can infer that he had a devoutly religious upbringing, and that his parents must have possessed the means to give him a solid literary education. He was familiar with the works of Jonathan Swift and Robbie Burns, among others. As I mentioned, his occupation is open to question. He could have been a miner, a labourer, or a sailor. During his teenage years, a long campaign led by Daniel O'Connell to win the Catholics the right to vote succeeded in 1829. But crushing poverty and rebellion still remained. A protracted struggle called the Tithe War was about impoverished tenant farmers being forced to pay tithes to support the Protestant church. And this was particularly annoying for Catholics, who also had to pay tithes to their own church. Even leaving religion aside, it was a very heavy tax. Sometimes it even exceeded the rent paid for the farm itself. And for Catholics, it came on, as I mentioned, Catholics, it came on top of the tithe they already paid. The government enforced confiscations of land of produce and cattle, and these were resisted. This led to violent clashes with underground organisations of young men called the White Boys, or in Irish, na Buachal Bána. There's a poem of Frank's that was published in Australia many years later, a dialogue between two Hibernians in Botany Bay, which, taken at face value, shows Paddy, a repentant tithe rebel, deploring the agitation that led to his exile and imprisonment. His friend, Darby, tells him, "You robbed your poor soul of felicity's joys by joining yourself to the cursed White Boys." Paddy confirms this. "Cursed Daniel O'Connell is the great agitator, is, in my opinion, a double-faced traitor. From his seditious harangues had I kept away, I ne'er should have visited Botany Bay. Tell the boys to desist from killing peelers and arson, but cheerfully pay the tithe proctor and parson. Why should they, Darby, be left in the lurch? You know they're the head of the Protestant Church. To protect them, faith, I'd spill my blood every drop, and not only the 10th, but the half of my crop I'd freely give them without hesitation, to save me from botany and vile transportation." I don't think we're meant to take Paddy's contrition seriously. The first known facts of Frank McNamara's life emerge in January 1832, when the Kilkenny Journal reported on a particularly interesting trial at the Kilkenny courthouse. As we before observed, there was nothing of importance or out of the usual course of petty crime incidental to a large and populous city. Of the 5 persons sentenced to transportation, not one was a native of Kilkenny. They were all strangers and quite unconnected with the neighbourhood. Mary Bagnall, for stealing muslin out of the shop of Mr. Finn of High Street, 7 years transportation. Same sentence on Francis McNamara, a real Corkonian, for breaking the shop windows of Mr. John MacDonnell and stealing therefrom a piece of worsted plaid. The cross-examination of 2 witnesses by this prisoner afforded much amusement to the court. His peculiar accent, cutting remarks and mode of delivery were both quaint and forcible. "Please your wordship, as to Mr. Prince the Constable, his oath should not be thought much of against me. He may know the weight of that book in pennyweights and scruples, but of its awful meaning and substance he knows nothing, often as he's kissed it. He should have the eye of a hawk and the vigilance of a cat to see me do what he swears. By the virtue of your oath, young man," to the shopman, "did you get directions from any persons as to how you were to swear against me?" "By virtue of my oath, I did not." To the constable he put the same question and received a like answer. "Now, your wordship, I must prove them both perjurer. Did not that decent-looking gentleman," it will be perceived he meant Mr. John Waters, the clerk of the court, "did not that decent-looking gentleman sitting under your worship in a loud and distinct manner, and that nobody could mistake, direct them to swear the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?" On the verdict of guilty being returned, sentence was immediately passed, and he was ordered from the dock. Prior to his leaving it, he flourished his hand, and with a cheerful and animated countenance, and in a loud voice, said, "I dread not the dangers by land or by sea that I'll meet on my voyage to Botany Bay. My labours are over, my vocation is past, and 'tis there I'll rest aisy and happy at last." A few months later, on May 10th, in the spring of 1832, 198 convicts were marched down to the docks at Cork to take ship for the colony. Among them was one brash and overconfident youth, aged 21, 5 feet 5 inches tall, with broad full features, grey eyes, fresh complexion and light brown hair, bearing a scar at the outer corner of his right eye. The vessel was named Eliza II, and her voyage to Sydney took a little under 4 months. During that time, Frank was issued with religious books and given medicines for constipation. Yes, folks, you're going to get every detail that history brings us. He was also given 24 lashes for bad conduct by one of the ship's officers, James Gordon. This fellow is a sad scamp, and yet far above the common herd in some respects. He has considerable abilities, has written some very palpable lines on his trial and sentence since he came on board, and has a very extensive knowledge of the Scriptures. He, it appears, was tried for a very slight offence, but his conduct on his trial was so bad that he was transported for 7 years. He recited a mock heroic poem of his own composing in which he ridiculed judge, jury, and other officers of the court that had tried him. This, of course, enhanced his offence and added to his punishment. At this point, I would say that I can't see why James Gordon would think that, because we've seen that Mary Bagnall and the other petty thieves who were tried on the same day as Frank all received the same sentence of 7 years transportation. But in any case, we'll resume. Musha Darby, my friend, ain't the sea mighty deep? Rather than be a sailor, I'd enlist for a sweep. For sweeps can repose on their soft sooty pillows, while mariners are tossed up and down on the billows. But if ever I return from cursed New South Wales, I'll tell the old people some wonderful tales, describing the elements and waves in commotion, and the curious animals I've seen in the ocean. How black whales and sperm in droves gathered round us, spouting water on our decks sufficient to drown us. How sharks followed after us like peelers and swaddies, anxiously awaiting to devour the dead bodies. The sharks following Eliza too had 2 such meals during the voyage. I am a native of the land of Erin, and lately banished from that lovely shore. I left behind my aged parents and the girl I adore. In transit storms as I set sailin', like a bold mariner my course did steer. Sydney harbour was my destination, that cursed harbour at length drew near. I then joined banquet in congratulation on my safe arrival from the briny sea. But alas, alas, I was mistaken, 12 years transported to Moreton Bay. Early one morning, as I carelessly wandered by the Brisbane waters, I chanced to stray. I saw a prisoner sadly bewailing, while on the sun-beaming banks he lay. He said, I have been a prisoner at Port Macquarie, Norfolk Island and Emu Plains, at Castle Hill and Kirstoongabby. At all those places I've worked in chains. But of all places of condemnation, in each penal station of New South Wales, Moreton Bay I have found no equal, for excessive tyranny each day prevails. Early in the morning, as the day is dawning, to trace from heaven the morning dew, up we are started at a moment's warning, our dismal slavery for to renew. Our overseers and superintendents, all these cursed tyrants' language we must obey, or else at the triangles our flesh is mangled. That is our wages at Moreton Bay. For 3 long years I was beastly treated, and heavy irons each day I wore. My poor back with flogging has been lacerated, and oft times painted with crimson gore. Like the Egyptians and ancient Hebrews, we were sorely oppressed by Logan's yoke, till kind Providence came to our assistance and gave this tyrant his fatal stroke. Yes, he was hurried from that place of bondage, where he thought he would gain renown. But a native black who lay in ambush gave this monster his fatal wound. Now that I've got once more to cross the ocean and leave this place called Moreton Bay, where many a man from downright starvation lies mouldering today beneath the clay. Fellow prisoners, be exhilarated, and your former sufferings don't bear in mind. For it's when from bondage we are extricated, we will leave those tyrants far, far behind. The events just described took place in 1830, 2 years after Frank arrived in Sydney, but no doubt they would have been related to him with great enthusiasm by his fellow cellmates. Once arrived in Sydney on September 6, 1832, Frank was assigned as a servant to a settler named John Jones. A story published many years later relates that he was sent to a station in the interior. The first duty appointed him was to drive off the cockatoos from a paddock of newly sown grain. Frank performed this duty in the following provoking manner. He wrote out a number of threatening notices to the cockatoos. They were prohibited from crossing the fence to the grain, and these notices he put at the tops of poles which he fastened at regular distances all round the paddock fences. When asked by the super what all those papers meant, he replied, "Did you not tell me to order the cockatoos off the ground?" Bonded to a colonist, it often required only a trifling offence to be sent back to prison, where, if your behaviour showed no improvement, you would go to an ironed gang for worse treatment. Young Frank McNamara was not a model prisoner. During the first couple of years of his sentence, he was given 6 months in irons on Goat Island, after which he escaped from a road gang, but was soon recaptured and tied to the triangle at Hyde Park Barracks and flogged. After that, he was set to work on the treadmill in Carter's Barracks. Carter's Barracks is, for Australians, it's where Sydney Central Station currently stands. The treadmill was a wooden contraption, something like the propeller of a paddle steamer, which prisoners were chained to and climbed all day like an endless stairway to grind grain into flour for the settlers. After another failed attempt at escape, Frank was confined aboard the Phoenix hulk. The Phoenix was an old, damaged 700-ton vessel that had been put into service by Governor Brisbane to give employment to bushrangers against whom I propose to proceed in the most vigorous way the law will admit, equal in point of accommodation to a jail, a great accession of strength and terror to the police of the colony. There were 260 other prisoners with Frank, in what one of them described as a floating den of infamy, where scenes of depravity which human nature shudders to contemplate were exhibited with apparent delight. During the year he spent aboard, Frank was twice flogged, once for having a stolen shirt, 25 lashes, and again for insubordination, 75 lashes. 2 weeks after Frank's return to Hyde Park Barracks, Jubilation spread among the prisoners there with the news that John Jenkins, a young convict turned bushranger, had shot and killed Dr. Robert Wardell, a barrister and a founding editor of The Australian. Wardell had been out riding on his farm by the Cooks River in Petersham when he discovered that 3 escapees had built a hut to shelter in. Incensed at the trespass, he'd recklessly confronted them and received a bullet from Jenkins for his trouble. The Sydney Morning Herald reported on the 13th of November 1834 that the extraordinary and reckless conduct The extraordinary and reckless conduct of the culprit Jenkins on his trial made such an impression on the minds of the public that on Monday morning last, the time appointed for his execution, the neighbourhood of the jail was crowded to a degree never before observed on any similar occasion, to witness the last scene of one of the most depraved of the human species. At the usual time, the culprits were led into the yard, to the foot of the scaffold, attended by their respective clergymen. Tattersdale entered first, accompanied by the Reverend W. Cowper, and testified the most sincere repentance and devotion through the melancholy scene. Jenkins followed, staring wildly around on the spectators and seemingly perfectly indifferent to the ignominious fate that awaited him. McCormack appeared penitent, but his demeanour on the whole seemed to indicate extreme despair and dejection. The prayers being ended, the under-sheriff read the warrant which consigned them to their fate. Then Jenkins ascended the ladder with the greatest expedition, and on arriving on the scaffold, went over to one of the ropes suspended from the fatal beam, and struck it with his hand in a playful manner. The dreadful preliminaries being adjusted, Jenkins addressed the felons in the yard to the following effect. "Well, goodbye, my lads. I have not time to say much to you. I acknowledge I shot the doctor, but it was not for gain. It was for the sake of my fellow prisoners, because he was a tyrant. And I have one thing to recommend you as a friend. If any of you take to the bush, shoot every tyrant you come across, and there are several now in the yard who ought to be served so. I have done several robberies, and for fear that any innocent man should suffer on my account, I have made a confession to the gaoler, and given such marks and tokens as will prove it was I that committed the acts." Jenkins then gave a short list of his victims. "I have not time to say any more, lads, but I hope you will all pray for me." This address being ended, the rope was secured round his neck, and the other culprits shook hands. As he approached his unhappy companion in crime, who appeared to be absorbed in prayer and making pious ejaculations, he said, Come, my lad, none of that crying. It's no use crying now. We'll be all right in 10 minutes' time." He then gave him a hearty shake of the hand and took his stand. The clergyman having retired and the arrangements being complete, the platform fell. No doubt, Jenkins' speech united the prisoners in bonds of solidarity and was met with loud cheers from Frank and the others, and with indignant fury from the tyrants, who soon afterwards discontinued public executions and took to hanging the condemned in private. The next year was 1835, and it was very probably the most brutal one of Frank's life. But he wasn't alone. It is interesting to hear what a visitor to the barracks around this time had to say of the place. One of the officers, who had been there only about 15 months, said that upwards of 1,000 men had been flogged in the course of that period. He stated his opinion to be that, how much soever men may dread flagellation when they have not been subjected to it, they are generally degraded in their own esteem and become reckless after its infliction. This we have found to be a very prevailing opinion in the colony. As the year progressed, Frank showed little dread of flagellation and was punished with monthly torture. On January 26th, for being absent from duty, he was given 3 days in the cells, which is terminology meaning solitary confinement. In February, he was insubordinate and received 25 lashes and another 100 lashes in March for using obscene language. In April, he was charged with assaulting a constable and was brought to the police court in Sydney, where before passing sentence the presiding magistrate asked him, "When do you think you will obtain your freedom? You are constantly appearing here and receiving additional sentences." "That I can easily answer, your worship." "I rather think it will be a most difficult matter for you to do, as it is almost beyond calculation." "Not so, your worship, for if you will allow me, I will tell you." "Well, when?" "When Sydney town of high renown goes to the Windsor races, when the Surrey Hills and Barker's Mills do visibly change places, when New South Wales is blessed by God, which I think will never be, when branches new grace Aaron's rod, that day I will be free. When Rossi, Bowman, and such men show to poor convicts justice, and when the world is taxed again by Caesar, feigned Augustus, when David's bear and Balaam's ass dine with King Solomon's bee, and when Lord Farnham goes to mass, that day I will be free. When horses all wear Hessian boots, and mountains are brought low, when bullocks play on German flutes, and lilies cease to blow, when geese like Presbyterians preach, and truth is proved a libel, when heaven is within our reach, and deists love the Bible, when Britain's Isle goes to the Nile, or visits Londonderry, and the hill of Howth goes to the south, or to the county Kerry, when Dublin town of good renown pays a visit to the Dee, and when millstones on the ocean float, that day will see me free." Nana. Hear that? Ooh, whoop, whoop. There we are. Yeah. One more, one more. What's it doing? "That is about the time. Take him away for another 12 months. Frank was led away in chains, but only a month later. He was given 36 lashes for refusing to work and insolence, 50 lashes in June for using threatening language. In August, there's an intriguing episode, 75 lashes for destroying a government cart, but unfortunately, no details of the incident. Finally, Frank spent Christmas 1835 with the sting of another 50 lashes still fresh on his back, once again for refusing to work. "I was convicted by the laws of England's hostile crown, conveyed across the swelling seas, in slavery's fetters bound, forever banished from that shore where love and friendship grow, that loss of freedom to deplore, and work the labouring hoe. Despised, rejected, and oppressed, in tattered rags I'm clad. What anguish fills my aching breast and drives me almost mad when I hear the settler's threatening voice say, 'Arise to labour, go! Take scourging convict for your choice, or work the labouring hoe.' Growing weary of compulsive toil beneath the noontide sun, while drops of sweat bedew the soil, my task remains undone. I'm flogged for wilful negligence, or the tyrant calls it so. Oh, what a doleful recompense for labouring with the hoe. Behold yon lofty woodbine hills, where the rose in the morning shines, those crystal brooks which do distil and mingle with those vines. There seems to be no pleasure gained, they but augment my woe, whilst here an outcast doomed to live and work the labouring hoe. You generous sons of Erin's Isle, whose heart for glory burns, pity a wretched exile who his long-lost country mourns. Restore me, heaven, to liberty, whilst I lie here below. Untie this clue of bondage and release me from the hoe. Release me from the hoe. Release me from the hoe. Untie this clue of bondage and release me from the hoe. The following year, 1836, was one of fewer punishments. In March he was transferred to the Phoenix Hulk again. This time he was employed to serve on the boat's crew, because as we remember, he may have been a sailor in his former life. And his conduct was described in the official record as tolerable, but only 10 days after that entry, he was flogged for neglect of work. Now comes an incident which gives us an example of the improvised wit that we must assume Frank has been employing all this time without much of it being recorded. Late in the winter of 1836, Frank was keeping the chill out of his bones in the damp hold of the Phoenix Hulk, and found to be in a state of intoxication, he was brought before Captain David Murray, who ordered him to be given 10 days solitary confinement. Asked whether he had anything to say, he replied, "Captain Murray, if you please, make it hours instead of days. You know it becomes an Irishman to drown the shamrock when he can." In the next year, 1837, Frank attempted his third escape. Although he was able to abscond a total of 5 times during his career, he never managed to remain at liberty for very long. Unlike his hero, the famous Jack Donahue, about whom he wrote a celebratory ballad, only fragments of which survive, Frank was recaptured without a blazing gun battle. 60 days treadmilling at Carter's barracks was arguably better than a bullet through the chest, but even so, Frank wouldn't cooperate until 50 more scars were added to his mangled back. Early in 1838, a new chapter opens in Frank's life when he is assigned to the Australian Agricultural Company, commonly referred to as the AA Co, and sent to work as a shepherd at Killala on the Peel River, which is up near Tamworth. Although the work was lonely, exposed to the elements and occasionally dangerous, since isolated shepherds were vulnerable to attack from Aboriginal warriors or bushrangers, it represented a vast improvement from his point of view. In a later poem, Frank would depict his life at Killala as practically Elysian. However, before even 2 years had passed, Frank was transferred to Stroud, which is north of Newcastle, and there, on October 23rd, 1839, he wrote down his longest surviving work, A Convict's Tour to Hell. This is a Dante-esque work, and it mentions various villains. Some of the references were obscure, and I've deleted those, but one I should explain before starting, that we'll encounter the name Jack Ketch. He was a high-profile executioner in the 17th century, and his name became synonymous with hangman in general from that point on. You prisoners of New South Wales, that frequent watch-houses and jails, a story to you I will tell. 'Tis of a convict's tour to hell, whose valour had for years been tried upon the highway before he died. At length he fell to death a prey. It proved for him a happy day. Downward he bent his course, I'm told, as one destined for Satan's fold, and no refreshment would he take until he arrived at the Stygian lake. A tent he then began to fix, contiguous to the river Styx, and thinking no one would molest him, he leaped when Charon thus addressed him. Stranger, I say, from whence art thou? And thine own name, pray, tell me now. Kind sir, I come from Sydney jail. My name I don't mean to conceal, but since you seem anxious to know it, on earth I was called Frank the Poet. Are you that person? Charon cried. I'll carry you to the other side. 5 or 6 pence I mostly charge for the like passage in my barge, but, stranger, do not troubled be, for you shall have a passage free. Frank, seeing no other succour nigh, with the invitation did comply, and having a fair wind and tide, they soon arrived at the other side. And leaving Charon at the ferry, Frank went in haste to purgatory, and rapping loudly at the gate of Limbo, or the middle state, Pope Pius VII soon appeared, in gown, beads, crucifix, and beard, and gazing at the poet the while, accosts him in the following style. Stranger, art thou friend or foe? Your business here I fain would know. Quoth the poet, For heaven I'm not fitted, and here I hope to be admitted. Pius rejoined, Thine are your hopes. This place was made for priests and popes. It is a world of our own invention, but, friend, I've not the least intention to admit such a foolish elf, who scarce knows how to bless himself. Quoth Frank, Were you mad or insane when first you made this world of pain? For here I see naught but fire, a share of which I can't desire. Here I see weeping, wailing, gnashing, and torments of the newest fashion. Therefore I call you a silly elf, who made a rod to whip yourself. But may you, like all honest neighbours, enjoy the fruits of all your labours. Frank then bid the Pope farewell, and hurried to that place called Hell. And having found the gloomy gate, Frank knocked aloud to know his fate. He louder knocked, and louder still, when the devil came. Pray, what's your will? Alas, cried the poet, I've come to dwell with you and share your fate in hell. Said Satan, That can't be, I'm sure, for I detest and hate the poor, and none shall in my kingdom stand except the grandees of the land. But Frank, I think you're going astray. Convicts never come this way, but soar to heaven in droves and legions, that place so-called in the upper regions. So, Frank, I think, with an empty purse you shall go further, and fare no worse. Well, cried the poet, since 'tis so, one thing of you I'd like to know, since I'm at present in no hurry. Have you one here called Captain Murray? Yes, Murray is within this place. Would you, said Satan, see his face? May God forbid that I should view him, for aboard the Phoenix Hulk I knew him. Who is that, sir, who in yonder blaze on fire and brimstone seems to graze? Ah, 'tis Captain Logan of Moreton Bay, and Williams, who was killed the other day. He was overseer at Gross Farm, and done poor convicts no little harm. Cook, who first discovered New South Wales, and he that first invented jails, are both tied to a fiery stake which stands in yonder boiling lake. Hark, do you hear that dreadful yelling? It issues from Dr. Wardell's dwelling, and all those fiery seats and chairs are fitted up for dukes and mayors and nobles of judicial orders, barristers, lawyers, and recorders. Here I beheld legions of traitors, hangmen, jailers, flagellators, commandants, constables, and spies, informers, and overseers likewise. In flames of brimstone they were toiling, and lakes of sulphur round them boiling. Hell did resound to their fierce yelling. Alas, how dismal was their dwelling. Prostrate I beheld a petitioner. It was the company's commissioner. Satan, said he, my days are ended. For many years I've superintended the Australia Company's affairs, and I punctually paid all arrears. Sir, should you doubt the hopping colonel, at Carrington you'll find my journal, legibly penned in black and white, to prove that my accounts were right. And since I've done your will on earth, I hope you'll put me in a berth. Then I saw old Sergeant Flood. In Vulcan's hottest forge he stood, He gazed at me. His eyes, with ire, appeared like burning coals of fire. In fiery garments he was arrayed, and like an Arabian horse he brayed. He on a bloody cutlass leaned, and to a lamppost he was chained. He loudly called out for assistance, or begged me to end his existence. "Cheer up," said I, "be not afraid, remember number 3 stockade. In the course of time you may do well if you behave yourself in hell. Your heart on earth was fraught with malice, which oft drove convicts to the gallows, but now you'll atone for all the blood of prisoners shed by Sergeant Flood." Then I beheld that well-known trapman, the police runner called Izzy Chapman. Here he was, standing on his head, in a river of melted, boiling lead. "Alas," he cried, "behold me, stranger! I've captured many a bold bushranger, and for the same I'm suffering here. But lo, where yonder snakes draw near." On turning round, I saw slow worms and snakes of various kinds and forms, all entering at his mouth and nose, to devour his entrails, as I suppose. Then turning round to go away, bold Lucifer bade me to stay, saying, "Frank, by no means go, man, till you've seen your old friend Dr. Bowman. Yonder he tumbles, groans, and gnashes. He gave you many 1,000 lashes, and for the same he does bewail, for Oscar, with an iron flail, thrashes him well, you may depend, and will till the world comes to an end." Just as he spoke, a coach and 4, in full post-haste, came to the door, and about 6 feet of mortal sin, without leave or licence, trudged in. At his arrival 3 cheers were given, which rent, I'm sure, the highest heaven. And all the inhabitants of hell, with one consent, rang the great bell that never was heard to sound or ring since Judas sold our heavenly King. Drums were beating, flags were hoisting. There never before was such rejoicing, dancing, singing, joy or mirth, in heaven above or on the earth. Straightway to Lucifer I went, to know what these rejoicings meant. "Of sense," cried Lucifer, "I am deprived, since Governor Darling has arrived. With fire and brimstone I've ordained him, and Vulcan has already chained him." "Oh," said the poet, "I'm satisfied to hear that he is to be tied and burned in this world of fire. I think it's high time to retire. And having travelled many days o'er fiery hills and boiling seas, at length I found that happy place where all the woes of mortals cease." And rapping loudly at the wicket, cried Peter, "Where's your certificate? Or if you have not one to show, pray who in heaven do you know?" "Well, I know brave Donahue, young Troy, and Jenkins too, and many others whom floggers mangled, and lastly were by Jack Ketch strangled." "Peter," says Jesus, "let Frank in, for he is thoroughly purged of sin, and although in convict's habit dressed, here he shall be a welcome guest. Isaiah, go with him to Job, and put on him a scarlet robe. St. Paul, go to the flock straightway, and kill the fatted calf today, and go tell Abraham and Abel in haste now to prepare the table, for we shall have a grand repast, since Frank the poet has come at last." Then came Moses and Elias, John the Baptist and Matthias, and with the poet they all joined hands. Through heaven's conclave their rejoicings rang, and hymns of praise to God they sang. And as they praised his holy name, I woke and found 'twas but a dream. Frank's belief that divine providence sides with those who suffer under tyrannical oppression is clearly shown in this work. Let's look now in greater detail at his religious thought. He variously described himself to his jailers as a Protestant, but also on occasion as a Catholic. Temporary religious conversions were not uncommon because Protestant inmates were forced to attend a double service each Sunday, but Catholics only one. So from this period in Stroud, while he was still working as a shepherd, we find this anecdote. Frank was a Roman Catholic of a strange type, but he made fun of all religions, particularly the Orthodox part. At a station in New South Wales where the priest called quarterly, some untoward circumstance had detained his reverence, and Frank was detailed to officiate for the absent clergyman. He was so entertaining on this occasion that some of the officers interviewed him and extracted a promise that Frank would furnish them with a spice of his poetry on the creed he professed. And being strongly imbued with the ideas of convictism, naturally Frank wrote in that strain. Years ago when I was giving this show, I had to skip over, I had the sentence then, unfortunately, we've never heard this poem, but it turned up. It may well be that today we have that very poem, published in a 1905 anthology by Banjo Patterson. Although it appears anonymously in the book, John Meredith, who I mentioned in my acknowledgements, before he died, he cited the letter that submitted it for publication, and according to that letter, it was attributed to Frank the poet. And in any case, it very, very neatly fits in with that testimony we've just heard. The poem's called My Religion. Let Romanists all at the confessional nail. Let the Jew with disgust turn from it. Let the mighty crown prelate in church pander zeal. Let the Mussulman worship Mahomet. From all these I differ. Truly wise is my plan. With my doctrine perhaps you'll agree. To be upright and downright and act like a man, that's the religion for me. I will go to no church and to no house of prayer to see a white shirt on a preacher, and in no courthouse on a book will I swear to injure a poor fellow creature. For parsons and preachers are all a mere joke, their hands must be greased by a fee. But with the poor toiler to share your last toke, that's the religion for me. Let psalm-singing churchmen and Lutheran sing. They can't deceive God with their blarney. They might just as well dance Highland Fling or sing the fair fame of Kate Kearney. But let man unto man like brethren act. My doctrine this suits to a T. The heart that can feel for the woes of another, oh, that's the religion for me. Another source, written shortly after his death by a man who'd never met him, but nevertheless felt qualified to judge him, had this to say. Though reared in the Catholic faith, it was his delight to profess to be an unbeliever for the sole purpose of mischief. He had every part of Scripture at his tongue's end, and he scorned to have studied the Bible to justify himself as an adept at puzzling and irritating criticism. And where he could take provoking liberties with clergymen, he did not hesitate to do so. It was his boast that he had confounded 2 or 3 just after they had been preaching. On one occasion, he obliterated a whole verse and inserted in its place with his pen a sentiment utterly unscriptural. He did this so cleverly that it looked in no way different from the other print on the leaf, and he had the audacity to assert in the face of a clergyman that it was a part of Protestant scripture. With one of his own clergymen, he took an unpardonable liberty. Frank was reading the Illustrated London News. The reverend gentleman spoke very kindly to him. He immediately pretended that he had turned Protestant and began to feign an anxiety to convert him to the Protestant faith. Father, name redacted, rose up and left him to his own reflections. Frank was offensively eccentric in his manners. He never put string to his shoes, assigning as a reason that God never made man to stoop to anything so low as his feet. He generally wore his small clothes inside out. At Newcastle, the AA Company ran a colliery, serving the colony's growing demand for coal. But the convict labour force that it worked, once 550 strong, had declined until in the late 1830s there remained about 100. Presumably some of these losses were from mining accidents. Frank's earliest prison record had described him as a miner, and if the company knew this, they would certainly have wanted him to go underground for them. Frank did not care for the idea at all, and turned his creative energies to avoiding the peril, even enlisting the help of some rather unlikely allies to petition the AACO's acting commissioner James Ebsworth as follows. A petition from the AA Company's flocks at Peel's River in behalf of the Irish Bard. By permission of the great Esquire Hall, being assembled here this day, ununanimously, bleating all for him that's far away. Our noble sires in the rich vales of Germany long sported, but we, alas, to New South Wales by the company were imported. We were born across the main, from Holland and from Russia, some from Saxony, more from Spain, France, Switzerland and Prussia. We, the prime of the company's stock, fat wethers, rams and ewes, none excepted, all the flock feel for the poet's woes. Oft he is charmed with his notes, the plains of fair Killala. To him we owe our fleecy coats, our flesh, our hides, our tallow. He ever proved our constant friend, 'tis plain from our contrition. In his behalf, therefore we send the following petition. For years upon the poet's lawn we've grazed, and leaped o'er many a hurdle. To you our voices all are raised, most noble Ebsworth of Burrell. To honour thee we never cease, with reverence most profound. How much more, sire, when you release the poet from underground? Each morning, when the watchful cock announced the approach of day, at the folds he was seen with his flock before Sol's glittering ray. The lofty wood-crowned hills adorned were seen on the plains. The truant-like negligence he scorned of all the neighbouring swains. By the fair Peel's evergreen side we feasted every day. Our wants there amply were supplied, whilst our bard's merry lay joined with the notes of the sweet thrush with melody filled the air. Birds to him flocked from every bush, so sweet his carols were. Our tender lambs with him would play, and in his bosom lie. To hawks they'd often fall a prey, but for his watchful eye. He reared them with a father's care, and fed the sickly ewes, while others shepherds gambling were on cards and dominoes. Our wily foes, the native dogs, he chased for many a mile. St. Patrick never drove the frogs so swift from the western isle. The king of Thessaly's numerous flocks once Telemachus kept, and from coverts and caverns in the rocks, bears, lions and tigers crept to hear the music of his lute. But our bard's plaintive songs not only charmed the senseless brute, but gathered the birds in throngs. Far from the Peel's evergreen plains, in some wild, lone retreat, in bitter and heart-rending strains, we'll mourn our patron's fate. Our cries from the hills shall resound to the extremes of the poles, if our friend goes underground at Newcastle to wheel coals. Why should the poet be sent down to toil in a coal pit? Such service best suits a clown, but not a man of wit. We yet shall hear his merry songs on fair Killala's plain. Kind heaven shall avenge the wrongs of our much injured swain. When Christ from heaven comes down, straightway all his Father's laws to expound, McNamara shall work that day for the company underground. When the man in the moon to Moreton Bay is sent in shackles bound, McNamara shall work that day for the company underground. When the Cape of Good Hope to Twofold Bay comes for the change of £1, McNamara Macnamara shall work that day for the company underground. When cows in lieu of milk yield tay, and all lost treasures are found, Macnamara shall work that day for the company underground. When the Australia Company's heaviest dray is drawn 80 miles by a hound, Macnamara shall work that day for the company underground. When a frog, a caterpillar and flea travel the world around, Macnamara shall work that day for the company underground. When turkey cocks on Jews' harps play and mountains dance at the sound, Macnamara shall work that day for the company underground. When Christmas falls on the 1st of May and O'Connell's King of England crowned, Macnamara shall work that day for the company underground. When thieves ever robbing on the highway for their sanctity are renowned, Macnamara shall work that day for the company underground. When the quick and the dead all stand in array, sighted at the trumpet's sound, even then, damn me if I'll work a day for the company underground, nor overground. These efforts failed, and Frank was transferred to Newcastle. While there, he wrote another petition on a different subject, which, like the other poems, contained a lightness and humour that, on this occasion at least, may have won over the authorities. A petition from the chain gang at Newcastle to Captain Furlong, the superintendent, praying him to dismiss a scourger named Duffy from the cookhouse and appoint a man in his room. With reverence and submission due, kind sir, these words are sent to you, and with them a good wish too. Long may you reign, and like Wellington at Waterloo, fresh laurels gain. Your petitioners are under thy care. In mercy, therefore, hear our prayer, nor let us wallow in despair, but soothe each pang, and allow no flogger to prepare food for your gang. 'Tis said that by your ordination our late cook lost his situation, and Duffy is in nomination his berth to fill, but has not got our approbation, nor never will. Your judgment, sire, put to good use, nor burthen us with foul abuse. Full long we've drunk the dregs and juice of black despair, yet we can find another screw loose or two somewhere. Our jaws now daily will grow thinner, and stomachs weak as I'm a sinner. For Duffy is a human skinner, most barbarous wretch. Each day I'd rather have my dinner cooked by Jack Ketch. It matters not whether salt or fresh, even his touch would spoil each dish. His cooking we can never relish, we'd rather starve, for be assured 'tis human flesh he best can carve. To any rational being I appeal, whether he's fit to cook a meal for a vile caterpillar, or a snail, or beast of prey. Men he is scourged in every jail in Botany Bay. I know the damned divils, when they sit to dine, will long for a savoury bit. Now Duffy's just the person fit to boil their kettles, so send him to the bottomless pit to cook their victuals. But did he even touch our mate? A furnace our coppers wouldn't hate, and every knife and fork and plate would cry out shame, and in the midst of our debate would curse thy name. Or if St. Matthew's, Mark, John and Luke, and Moses who wrote the Pentateuch, consented to make this flogger our cook, I'd say 'tis foul. If I wouldn't swear it on the book, hell seal, hell seize my soul. Now, sir, your petitioners great and small, on bended knees before ye fall, nor let us in vain for redress call. Drive Duffy away, and as in duty bound we all will ever pray. 'Tis needless to say the prayer was granted. To escape the horrors of the coal mine, Frank took to the bush yet again, and this got him another 12 months in irons. They shipped him to Woolloomooloo Stockade in Sydney for a month before transferring him to Parramatta, where he spent the year 1840 in chains. Somehow during the summer he managed to get his dialogue between two Hibernians published in the Sydney Gazette. After 1840, there is a gap in Frank's prison records, but we meet him again building the road from Braidwood to Nowra, with a gang of convicts. One of that company was also a poet by the name of Con Flynn. Oh, those were the days when the grasses wide wet a horseman's feet on his morning ride, when the mighty bullocks their work days passed, as rations to convicts were served at last. And the tale is told, how it chanced one day that a smoking round came the convict's way. Then Frank the poet, as large as life, stood and tapped the beef with his carving knife, and intoned this verse, so the tale relates, to the crowded board of his grinning mates. Oh beef, what brought you here? You served the government many a year, you've felt the lash and sore abuse, and now you're here for prisoners' use. I will quote Con Flynn again at the end of the show, but for now, the official record resumes. In May 1842, Frank and 4 English prisoners were under escort from Braidwood to Sydney to stand trial, but the charges they faced have not been preserved in the historical record. Official correspondence reveals what then took place. Let's hear first from the police magistrate at Berrima. I have the honour to state for information of His Excellency the Governor that the escape of the prisoners from the custody of Constables Charles William and William Fawcett was occasioned by their disobedience to orders issued by me to the constables of the district, and carefully explained and repeated to each of them by the Chief Constable. They were strictly prohibited from stopping at public houses when on escort, and were required to abstain entirely from the use of spirituous liquors while engaged on that particular duty. On this occasion, the 2 constables stopped with their prisoners at a spot about 150 yards from Mrs. Badgerry's inn in Bargo. 3 bottles of rum were bought and drunk by the prisoners and the constables. It is probable that this was done designedly by the prisoners with a view to effecting their escape, for they had not proceeded above a mile from this spot, when, taking advantage of the effects produced by the liquor on the constables, one of them succeeded in suddenly wresting the musket from one constable and presenting it at him, while the rest surrounded the other, threw their whole weight upon him, and though securely handcuffed to a travelling chain by one hand, managed to overpower and disarm him. On my becoming informed of the particulars, the 2 constables were, of course, immediately dismissed from their situations. They have since been committed to take trial for their misdemeanour. Sergeant Michael Doyle's deposition describes their arrest 4 days later. I'm stationed at Liverpool. On Saturday 28th last, I was informed that 5 prisoners had escaped from the escort between Berrima and Picton. I at once started troopers O'Neill and Wilmot in pursuit of them, and after reporting the circumstances to headquarters, I went after them myself. On the following day, Sunday, I overtook the troopers in Campbelltown, and we went together toward Razorback. We halted for the night there, and at about between 10 and 11 o'clock we heard a noise of men approaching. We rushed out on the road and found the 5 prisoners with arms in their possession. We called on them to throw down their arms, which after some hesitation they did, and we found that one of the muskets was loaded and primed. When we took the prisoners in charge, they stated that these were the arms which they took from the constables from whose custody they had escaped. On July 4th, each of the 5 daring runaways was convicted of being illegally at large with firearms, and each was sentenced to be transported to a penal settlement for the term of his natural life. But as Frank and his friends waited on Cockatoo Island for the boat that would take them to Tasmania, to Van Diemen's Land, the magistrates were petitioning the governor, George Gipps, to commute their sentences to 10 years, since their investigations had revealed that the prisoners had committed no depredations in the short time they were at large. The governor granted the request, and just as an aside here, I recently learned Governor Gipps was an all-right kind of guy. He was an opponent of the squatters taking all the land, and he also did his best to defend Aborigines. He was very much in favour of trying the Mile Creek Massacre murderers, and some of whom were eventually executed. Anyway, returning to the story, Governor Gipps granted the request, but the name of one of the five, William Thomas, had been left off the petition, and a second one was made on his behalf. I'm sure poor Bill Thomas waited nervously for the result, until on the very day that the schooner Water Lily was due to take the men to Port Arthur, good news arrived at the last minute, given verbally by this man, Superintendent Captain Innes. His sentence had been commuted to 7 years, not 10. Hang on, can you actually see Captain Innes?
Not at the moment.
Okay, yeah. So this is a... If I try and go too fast, it... Okay. Did you see Governor Gipps? That's him. Well, that's an actor playing him. Okay, so so they were sentenced to life, but they hadn't done any robberies. So the magistrate said, "Governor, give him only 10 years," and so he did. Okay. Good news arrived at the last minute, including Bill Thomas in the reprieve. But Captain Innes made a mistake. He said that the sentence had been commuted to 7 years, not 10. Innes had been misinformed as the result of a clerical error. And so, during the next 2 years, Bill Thomas, who could read and write considerably better than some of his jailers, was able to petition successfully for a further commutation and receive the benefit of the mistake. Since Frank McNamara's and John Jones's cases were indistinguishable from Bill Thomas's, and I'm assuming that this means that those three weren't holding muskets, the other two were holding the muskets when they were arrested, all three eventually had their sentences reduced. So Frank's life sentence went down to 10, went down to 7. Water Lily arrived at Port Arthur on October 29th. Within hours of disembarking, Frank was centrally involved in a serious challenge to prison discipline. The convicts were being made to carry wooden shingles from the forest where they'd been cut into the settlement. The system designed for this involved one prisoner with a light load running ahead of the rest of the heavily laden gang who were expected to keep pace with him. One of the convicts, a man named Hugh Leonard, wrote an account of how this system was overthrown. "Everything went on well until one morning, the brig Isabella came into the bay, and I was told it was loaded with Sydney men from Cockatoo Island. The next day they came ashore and were put into the carrying gang. The runner, as usual, started off, but the Sydney men all kept in their ranks and walked on steadily. The overseer shouted for them to close up, but they took no notice of him, so that other men were coming back for loads before they reached the first resting place. We had each had bundles of shingles to carry, and then the Sydney men said, 'Now do you think these bundles are overweight?' Some of them replied, 'Yes.' Then they emptied some of the shingles out and tied them up again, so that by the time they had done that, the other men had been into the settlement with their loads. When they got into the settlement, they were marched in front of the office and the commandant came. The loads were weighed and found to be underweight. The commandant then ordered the flagellators to be sent for, and the triangles, and the clerk took down all their names. Amongst the rest, there was the notorious Jackie, Frank the poet, and Jones and Kavanagh. There were upwards of 30 pairs of cats and 4 flagellators, and the surgeon, a young man named Dr. Benson, who kept laughing and joking and playing with his stick as unconcerned as though he was in a ballroom. When their names were taken, every other man was called out and received 36 lashes. A fresh flagellator giving every 20 lashes, and they try to see who can give it the worst. Next morning they went on just the same. They were then ranked up and all were flogged and sent back to work again. The overseer still snapping at them, and if they could have got him into the bush, they would have killed him. Next day they were all brought up again and received 7 days solitary confinement on bread and water. When they came out, they did just as before and were brought up before the commandant again, and he listened to what they had to say this time and ordered that there was to be no more running in the gang. His involvement in this labour dispute would have earned Frank some notoriety and respect among the fellow convicts, and by the time Christmas came, he also established his reputation as an entertainer. A stage having been erected in the centre of the yard, we had comic and sentimental singing, and also Portuguese Joe in the character of Darky. The famed Frank the poet threw off a few extempore verses for the amusement of the company. That was an extract from the biography of Martin Cash, who absconded the very next day and began his career as a notorious bushranger. During the 5 years that Frank spent at Port Arthur, it's likely that he would have met a fellow Irishman with flaming red hair named John Kelly, whose nickname was Red, and whose destiny it was to have sons who would eclipse the fame of all Australian outlaws. Decades later, Ned Kelly would write in his Jerilderie letter, I'm sure that happens this time. Oops, you were meant to see that earlier. In his famous Jerilderie letter, a paraphrase of Frank's poem The Convict's Arrival, which I sang earlier. Transported to Van Diemen's Land to pine their young lives away in starvation and misery among tyrants worse than the promised hell itself, were doomed to Port Macquarie, Toongabbie, Norfolk Island and Emu Plains, and in those places of tyranny and condemnation were flogged to death and bravely died in servile chains. It was probably at Port Arthur that Frank first heard the story of how a transport called the Cyprus Brig had been captured by convicts and sailed to freedom a few years previously. A contemporary history of Van Diemen's Land attests to the popularity of Frank's response to this story. The prisoners who waged war with society regarded the event with exultation, and long after, a song composed by a sympathising poet was propagated by oral tradition and sung in choruses around the fires in the interior. Come, all you sons of freedom, a chorus join with me. I'll sing a song of heroes and glorious liberty. Some lads condemned from England sailed to Van Diemen's shore, their country, friends and parents perhaps never to see more. When landed in the colony, to different masters went. For trifling offences to Hobarton jail was sent. A second sentence being incurred, they were ordered for to be sent to Macquarie Harbour, that place of tyranny. The hardships we'd to undergo are matters of record. But who believes the convict, or who regards his word? For starved and flogged and punished, deprived of all redress, the bush our only refuge, with death to end distress. Hundreds of us were shot down for daring to be free, numbers caught and banished to lifelong slavery. Brave Swallow, Watt and Davis were in our noble band, determined at the first slant to quit Van Diemen's Land. Marched down in chains and guarded, on the Cyprus brig conveyed, the topsails being hoisted, the anchor being weighed. The wind it blew south-southwest, and on we went straightway, till we found ourselves wind-bound in gloomy Recherche Bay. 'Twas August 1829, with 31 on board. Lieutenant Carew left the brig, and soon we passed the word. The doctor too was absent, the soldiers off their guard. A better opportunity could never have occurred. Confined within a dismal hole, we soon contrived a plan to capture now the Cyprus, or perish every man. But 13 turned faint-hearted and begged to go ashore, so 18 lads rushed daring and took the brigand's store. We first addressed the soldiers, for liberty we crave. Give up your arms this instant, or the sea will be your grave. By tyranny we've been oppressed, by your colonial laws, but we'll bid adieu to slavery, or die in freedom's cause. We next drove off the skipper, who came to help his crew, then gave 3 cheers for liberty, 'twas answered cheerily too. We brought the sailors from below, and rowed them to the land, likewise the wife and children of Carew in command. Supplies of food and water we gave the vanquished crew, returning good for evil as we'd been taught to do. We mounted guard with watch and ward, and hauled the boat aboard. We elected William Swallow, and obeyed our captain's word. The morn broke bright, the wind was fair, we headed for the sea, with 1 cheer more for those on shore, and glorious liberty. For navigating smartly, Bill Swallow was the man, to set a course out neatly to take us to Japan. Then sound your golden trumpets, play on your tuneful notes. The Cyprus brig is sailing, now proudly now she floats. May fortune help the noble lads, and keep them ever free from gags and cats and chains and traps and cruel tyranny. Except for 1 week in solitary confinement, a year after he got there, there is no record of Frank being punished at Port Arthur after his conspicuous arrival. He either calmed down, or the prison regime was less brutal than formerly. During the first 10 months of his time in Van Diemen's Land, he and the other prisoners were subject to the genuinely humane concern of Lieutenant Governor John Franklin, whose attempts to reform the penal system were not appreciated by the colony's civil servants, and may have been a contributing factor in his removal. As Franklin then went to meet his famous destiny in an expedition to find a northwest passage from Hudson Bay to the Pacific, his berth was filled by John Eardley Wilmot. Wilmot, too, became unpopular with the Colonial Office because, among other things, he supposedly lacked an active care of the moral interests involved in the system of convict discipline. For example, he was trying to get prisoners under the age of 21 segregated from older convicts, but didn't manage to get that happening. In this environment, Frank's conduct was deemed good enough to earn him a ticket of leave on the 19th of January 1847. He'd been a prisoner for 15 years and was now 36 years old, finally extricated from bondage. Sometime later he received a conditional pardon and was granted his certificate of freedom on July 12th, 1849. Van Diemen's Land was suffering from economic depression, and work was scarce. Frank decided to leave and made for Launceston, where in August 1850 he took ship across Bass Strait. One of his contemporaries described his departure. When Frank was leaving Launceston for New South Wales, having got a conditional pardon, many of his old and new admirers assembled at the paddle steamer to give him a hearty send-off. Of course, they importuned him for a final screed, and the captain permitted him to ascend the paddle boat, where, spreading out his hands, he cried out, Land of lags and kangaroo, of possums and the scarce emu, farmer's glory, prisoner's hell, land of Sodom, fare thee well. Other versions of this maledictory farewell give the terms land of bums and land of buggers as well. Pardon me a moment. I'm trying to run two computers here that aren't behaving. Okay, how did we manage to get all the way back there? Have a drink. Is this going to be a while? Right. For a few months, Frank worked in Melbourne, but was before very long, gold was discovered. And now that he was free, Frank no longer found himself adverse to working underground. He headed to the goldfields south of Mudgee. We learn this from an unflattering report that came later by a Sydney Morning Herald journalist on the 8th of September 1853. Tambaroora has suffered severely from the rush to Burrendong and is by no means the place it once was, but a return tide has set in, without, however, benefiting to any material extent the old digging grounds. Many of the return parties have commenced operations upon the Piramal, where there is a vast extent of untried country, over which, upon the various points, upwards of 100 diggers are scattered. A local celebrity, who answers to the cognomen of Frank the Poet, has added his physical and poetical strength, where his bones and sinews are likely to be of more service than his brains. At the diggings, Frank befriended a miner called Robert Welsh, and the two men were together for the next 8 years. According to his mate, Frank earned a great deal of money and spent it very freely. I've known him to obtain hundreds a week at Tambaroora. This success notwithstanding, Frank still got occasional income from his penmanship. He drafted a decorative card commemorating the family history of an innkeeper in Windayer named John Calf in 1861. It seems, however, that the gold Frank so freely spent in these years was not invested in a healthy lifestyle. Very likely he drank it with his mates. In the winter of 1861, while working at Pipe Clay Creek with Bob Welsh and a new friend of theirs, John McDermid, Frank developed a chronic pain in his shoulder and began to spit blood. Although Frank's appetite remained good, according to Bob, the wind used to annoy him very much in the hut in which he resided. On Tuesday, 27th of August, Frank and Bob drank together for pretty much the whole day. The next day they went into Mudgee together and arranged to meet up later on at the Bushman's Arms Hotel. When Frank failed to show up, Bob went looking for him and found him at Phillips's. Frank was lying on a bed, half drunk, and asking for a drink of water. Bob tried to get him to stand up, but Frank could only reply, "Put your hand in my pocket and take out what is there." Next day, Thursday 29th, wondering what was keeping his mates so long in Mudgee, John McDermid came looking for them. He met Bob, who was nearly tipsy, in Phillips's tap room. "You promised not to get drunk." "How can I help it?" Bob replied. "Frank is very bad." John hurried to Frank's room and asked how he was doing, but he got no reply. After a little while, Frank managed to call Bob to his bedside and gave him the details of a debt that someone in Mudgee owed him. The poet's final words were that Bob should divide the money equally between himself and John, and then Frank McNamara died. An inquest was held on Friday morning by W. King Esquire, MD, coroner for this district, at the Fountain of Friendship on the body of Francis McNamara, alias Hill, better known as Frank the Poet. Arthur Thomas Pigott Cutting, being duly sworn, stated that he was a duly qualified medical practitioner. He had viewed and examined the body, and it was his opinion that the deceased came to his death by the effects of cold and inanition. The jury found a verdict accordingly. The coroner goes on to report that Frank left behind him no personal effects, excepting some papers. He never cared for clothes. There is no headstone bearing his name in the Mudgee or Windale cemeteries, so most probably he was buried in an unmarked grave. But he did leave a monument, of course, and now you have heard most of it. There is one final fragment that I will leave you with. Let's spin back 20 years to the time when Frank and his fellow poet Con Flynn were working on the Convict road from Braidwood to Nowra. Harry the Forger spoke up. "Faith, Frank, I don't know for sure what you'll be remembered most for, your verses or for that natural cross in the rocks on top of the Devil's Pinch, where you always doff your cap when you pass, which they name Frank the Poet's Cross." "Must a man be remembered at all?" asked Frank. "That goes without saying," replied Harry. "'Tis a poor soul indeed who leaves no signature on history when he departs. Significant and permanent if it is something great that he has done, or temporary and fading if he has merely passed that way and left no more than a track in the clay like a straying beast. 'Tis not an epitaph, but his signature on history, a symbol to keep his name in the minds of men as long as the caprice of fate decrees." Thank you for your time. Thank you for your attention. I do appreciate it.